The Hyundai Veloster N isn't just one of the best hot hatches in the world. For 2021, it's basically last hatch standing, because the Honda Civic Type R is going to take at least a few years off. The next generation of Honda Civic is coming very, very soon, so if you want to get your hands on a hot hatch in 2021 or 2022, the Veloster N is going to be one of your best options. If you want to spend more, obviously there are all-wheel drive vehicles like the upcoming Golf R or the Mercedes-Benz GLA. They have AMG versions with all-wheel drive, but nothing is going to be quite as affordable as this Veloster N. This sticks to the basic hot hatch formula, with front-wheel drive, a limited slip differential, and a lot of horsepower under the hood. But for 2021, there's some additional tweaks. Fortunately, Hyundai abides by the philosophy of, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So everything that you loved about the Veloster N is still here for 2021. But some of the things that folks weren't too crazy about are gone. We have new seats that are much more comfortable than the outgoing ones. We have a new 8-speed dual-clutch transmission that is better able to handle the demands of a high-performance drivetrain like this. It offers better cooling and smoother day-to-day driving performance. The performance package is now standard rather than optional, and there's some additional tweaks all the way around the vehicle. Versus the rest of the Veloster lineup, it definitely looks hungrier and angrier up front. We have the red accents down at the bottom of the bumper, full LED headlights up front with the distinctive little dotty accent lights right in there. And in case you're wondering, yes, this vehicle is sort of periwinkle blue, but of course, Hyundai's not calling this color periwinkle. Because the performance package is now standard, we get 19-inch wheels with 235 with summer tires standard. All seasons are interestingly not an option on the Veloster N, although logically you could do that yourself aftermarket if you needed to. We also have the high-performance N brakes right up front. The Veloster and the Veloster N have always been a bit of an odd duck in America because this is a subcompact 3-door hatchback, not a 4-door. So over here on the passenger side, we have one door, and on the driver's side, we have a slightly longer driver's door, so the pillar is not in the same position on each side. At 167.9 inches long, this is notably shorter than a Honda Civic Type R, which is honestly the only direct competitor, I think, to the Veloster N. And again, the Civic Type R is being discontinued. With the next generation of Civic, the Type R will return, but we don't know exactly when that will be. This is also not quite as hatchy as some of the competition, so the rear definitely has more of a sloped profile, but it's not as liftback or notchback or sportback, I guess you'd say, as the Civic Type R. The Civic Type R is 179 inches long, so it is considerably longer than this, but oddly enough, you don't get a full foot more interior room. It actually has only 2 inches of extra legroom versus the Veloster N, and about 5 cubic feet extra cargo capacity. So the two vehicles are a little bit more comparable than you might think, although the Veloster N is certainly narrower than the Civic. No performance car would be complete without angry tail lamps, so we find some back here. These are combination LEDs, so the turn signals and the backup lights are incandescent. We have functional and non-functional air vents on the bottom of the bumper, 2 big exhaust tips, aero treatments, and of course a red stripe running across the back. Completing the look, we have a pretty aggressive spoiler right across the top of the hatch, but I have to say this is definitely more discreet than the enormous wing that we find in the Type R. For 2021, the base price of the Veloster is up over $3,000 over the previous model year. But again, the performance package is standard. We get the newer features on the inside, and we get more driver assistance tech than we had before, including forward collision warning with autonomous emergency braking, blind spot warning, and rear cross traffic detection. One odd twist is that you don't get radar adaptive cruise control in the Veloster yet. Under the Veloster's hood, we find N engine. Sorry, I couldn't help myself there. This is a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo, not the 2.5-liter 4-cylinder turbo that we find in Hyundai's new N-line products. This one is tuned to 275 horsepower and peak torque output of 278 pound-feet of torque with an asterisk there. You'll get 278 pound-feet of torque in the overboost mode with the 8-speed dual-clutch transmission only. In regular operation, the peak is 260 pound-feet of torque. This engine is mated to your choice of a 6-speed manual or an 8-speed wet dual-clutch transmission that is different than the one that we found in last year's Veloster. This is Hyundai's latest 8-speed DCT design, and the wet clutch function not only improves cooling for the transmission, it improves smoothness out in stop-and-go and slow-and-go traffic, and then the 8 speeds give it a broader ratio spread than we found in the last transmission. Oddly enough, because of the ratios involved, the 8-speed DCT is actually going to be the least efficient transmission under here, and that's pretty unusual. You'll get 22 miles per gallon with that one, 25 miles per gallon if you get the 6-speed manual transmission. Both transmissions feature a limited slip front differential. Obviously, that's less power than you'll find in the Civic Type R, but this is a smaller vehicle, and the Type R does not have an 8-speed dual-clutch transmission, and Honda has been really resistant about putting a DCT in their performance vehicles. We know, for instance, that the upcoming Civic Si will not get one. It will have a manual transmission only. So the reality is that this vehicle with the 8-speed DCT is going to be faster 0 to 60 every single time versus the Honda Civic Type R, and significantly faster versus the average driver in a Civic Type R with the manual transmission. Even professional drivers have not been able to beat just the average Joe in this vehicle with the 8 DCT. However, manual transmission to manual transmission, it will depend on exactly how good you are at the clutch. All things being equal, with the manual, this should be a little bit slower. As you might expect, in a subcompact vehicle, the hatch in the Veloster is relatively small. It also is a little bit unusually high off the ground. You'll notice that the license plate is down here. We then have a large portion of bumper and then the opening for the hatch. And then the hatch descends about 13 inches from this sill. We have 19.9 cubic feet of storage space back here, so that's about 5 cubic feet below the Honda Civic Type R. But this cargo area is a little bit more practical than some of the options that you might be comparing this against. When it comes to my exclusive trunk comfort index, the sill makes it a little bit more difficult to get in the cargo area, but we have a very square area. So this is a bit more practical than the more triangular shape that we find in the Civic Type R, but the Civic does give you more cargo room total. You'll definitely notice the improved front seat design when you get inside. The bolstering is still pretty aggressive, so if you're much wider than I am, you might find these seats a little bit constrictive. We have pretty aggressive bottom bolsters right here and back bolsters as well. But the seat design itself is significantly more comfortable than before. We still don't have adjustable lumbar support, however, although I find that the lumbar support that we do have is in exactly the right place for me. If you don't like lumbar support that's terribly aggressive, however, you might find these seats a little bit less comfortable. This is still a manual driver's seat, likely due to the weight savings that such a seat design would give you, and these seats are actually a few pounds lighter than the ones before. Logically, the front passenger seat is also manual, but it lacks the height adjustment feature that we find on the driver's side. Unlike a two-door vehicle, getting in the back is pretty easy because this is a three-door, and the third door is over here on the right side. As a result of this third door, again, the passenger door up front is smaller than the driver's door, so they've just sort of split the difference in here. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks, and as you can see, my knees are really digging into this seat back. I have some headroom back here, but I do have to crane my head to one side in order to put my head back there to that headrest. You'll find 2 inches more combined legroom in a Civic Type R and 2 inches more rear headroom in the Civic as well. But logically, thanks to the 3-door design, the Veloster is certainly more practical than the average 2-door hatch, and I could push this seat forward and give myself a little bit more room in the back. Now, the Veloster is a 4-seat vehicle in this N trim. We get 2 cup holders right here in the middle, no center seat belt. The majority of this interior is unchanged from last year. Keep in mind that the base Veloster is relatively inexpensive, and the Veloster N shares a lot of those same components. All 4 seats get fixed height periwinkle seat belts. The front seats have fixed headrests with that large N logo right there in that backrest. And from here you can really see the difference between the sides. So the driver's seat is all the way back in the tracks at the same position that this passenger seat is, but the B-pillar on the driver's side ends up right there around the headrest, and over here on the passenger side, it's about 8 inches in front. The new seat design has a fabric insert in the middle and more periwinkle piping. The majority of the front door is made from hard plastics except for the armrest right there in the middle. The hard plastics continue along the dashboard. Again, keep in mind that the base Veloster is a relatively inexpensive subcompact hatch, 2 big air vents right here for the passenger, and then a moderately sized bin-style glove compartment. I was not able to fit a 10-inch tablet inside. In the middle of the dashboard, we now have an 8-inch color touchscreen infotainment system. The software has been tweaked a little bit versus the outgoing model, but it is definitely familiar if you've driven a Hyundai vehicle before. If we go back to the main menu, you'll notice that we have the newer interface for Hyundai infotainment systems. This features factory mapping, and if I click this N mode button, you'll see that the adjustment for the N mode vehicle settings is a little bit different than it was before. It's now all on one page. We get some additional gauges right here: oil temperature, torque, turbo pressure, etc. We have G-force, performance timer. I can adjust the custom mode, and it now uses a little spider graph, which I think is a little bit more intuitive for how it's going to deal with these various software programming functions. So I can have the suspension in its softest mode, the engine in its most aggressive, rev matching on, E-limited slip differential there, exhaust sound. Stability control is available in 3 different levels right there, as well as steering. If you want to know more about some of the various functions, you can choose the details option right there and see exactly what those various options are going to do for you. Over here under performance options, you can adjust the launch control and whether or not you want the shift indicator on. Below the infotainment system, we find the engine start-stop button, some controls for the infotainment system, the controls for the single-zone automatic climate control, a USB input for that infotainment system, large storage area, and then the shifter for the 6-speed manual transmission. Reverse is up and to the left, which is not my preference. I prefer it over on the right side and down. Behind the shifter, we find a handbrake and 2 large cup holders, a padded center armrest that does not cover that second cup holder, thankfully. It opens to reveal a moderately sized storage compartment with no additional power outlets. The instrument cluster is fairly simple and easy to read. We have a large physical speedometer and tachometer, and then a color multifunction display in the middle. This gives us things like the readouts of the vehicle's active safety systems, including the driver attention monitoring system, a lap timer, G-force meter, some additional gauges right there, turn-by-turn navigation directions, and of course your trip computer. The steering wheel is a little different than the regular Veloster's wheel. It doesn't have a flat bottom, it is a round design with sport grips over here. If you got the DCT, it would have paddle shifters on the back. Much like we see in BMW's M-Line products, we have a drive mode button over here where you can toggle through the various drive modes, and then we have an N button over here which takes you directly to the N mode or the custom drive mode. If this vehicle had the dual clutch transmission, there would be an additional button on the steering wheel for the N grin shift mode. That's what Hyundai calls overboost. Overboost will be active for 20 seconds and it bumps things up from 260 pound-feet of torque up to 278. On this side we find the controls for the standard regular cruise control, not adaptive, lane keeping right there. There's a button to turn on and off the rev matching function. And then over here on this side we find controls for the infotainment system. The Veloster N has always been a blast to drive. Now rather unfortunately they did not send me the model with the new 8-speed dual clutch transmission. I know that some folks are disappointed by me being disappointed that that's not the model that I got, but there's a reason for that. Most folks will be buying the Veloster N with the DCT, and that model is going to be the quickest 0 to 30, quickest 0 to 60, quickest in the quarter mile, etc. Because the computer can quite simply shift faster than you can. And that's one of the reasons that this model was able to go 0 to 60 in 4.9 seconds. That is definitely very swift and significantly faster than the best performance time I've ever gotten out of the Honda Civic Type R. Now, I have heard some folks have been able to get down to maybe 4.95 or 5.0 with the Civic Type R, time after time after time, really roasting the clutch, performance drivers out on really sticky surfaces, etc. But the average driver, they're not going to be able to get that kind of 0 to 60 time out of it, or out of this Veloster N, unless you get the dual clutch transmission. With this particular model, my best 0 to 60 time was about 5.5 seconds. Launches are a little bit trickier with a regular manual transmission and just one clutch. And of course, you're at the mercy of how willing you are to roast the clutch, how willing you are to possibly grind a gear, quick shift, etc. And you don't have to worry about any of that if you get the 8-speed DCT. That's one of the reasons I'm still disappointed that we don't find 8-speed DCTs in all the competition. But one of the reasons I'm really happy that Hyundai has decided to go in a different direction with their performance vehicles, and they are giving us a DCT. Thanks to the summer tires, the stopping distance was very, very short in the Veloster N, just 110 feet in this model. And of course, you'll get a massive amount of grip when you're driving out in your favorite winding mountain road. This is just a ton of fun to drive. Torque steer is very well controlled thanks to the electronic limited slip differential up front, and there's just so much torque happening from this engine that you don't really have to downshift as much if you really don't want to. And if you are downshifting, of course, we get those excellent rev match shifts that really increase the enjoyment factor with the Veloster N. There's not too much steering feedback coming from the front, but in the sportiest mode there is just a little bit, and honestly most vehicles with electronic power steering aren't going to be that much better than this. The best way to describe the Veloster N out on the road is that this is the same level of fun that we find in the Civic Type R, with, oddly enough, a tiny bit more refinement. And that's really high praise because the Type R is an absolute blast to drive. One of the best things about the Veloster N is that this is one of the least expensive vehicles available in America that has an adaptive suspension. It is currently in its firmest setting, and it is definitely very, very firm and bouncy. But if I put this in the normal mode, instantly things settle down. And while this is still firmer than a lot of subcompact crossovers or hatches or subcompact stands, whatever you might want to be cross-shopping with the Veloster N, this is still daily driver livable in its normal mode. And that's incredibly important for the demographic of the Veloster N, because this is designed to be the kind of sports car or sports hatch, whatever you want to call the Veloster N again, that you can commute to work in and have an awful lot of fun, or take out on a track. If you want to do that, you could definitely swap these tires out for even more track-focused performance tires, and certainly have an awful lot of fun out on your favorite autocross or even larger tracks, because this is pretty quick. Or if you're simply looking for a quick, fun hatch to integrate into your daily routine, that's exactly what Hyundai has designed the Veloster N for. And I really love the fact that you don't have to dig around in the infotainment system for the drive mode settings. You simply click the drive mode button on the steering wheel, toggle through the 3 main modes, or of course, hit the N button for N and custom. But everything about the Veloster N feels a little bit neater, a little bit tidier, a little bit better designed, especially the electronic systems and the adaptive suspension system. The one exception is cabin noise. At 50 miles an hour, I measured 74.5 decibels in here, which is pretty similar to the very limited edition of the Civic Type R that's had essentially all of its sound deadening removed. Especially out on a rougher road surface, you'll notice that this is definitely going to be louder than a Volkswagen Jetta GLI or a Golf GTI. But this has more power than we find in the GTI. This is somewhere between GTI and Golf R in terms of its performance, its power, its fun factor, etc. And of course, keep in mind that we are going to be getting a next generation Golf, so currently I'm talking about the current generation Golf lineup. Over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging just under 24 miles per gallon, so that is a little bit below the EPA score, but I can certainly forgive the Veloster N for that because I have been driving this pretty hard. This is just so much fun to drive. The limits of grip are exceptionally high thanks to the tires, the suspension system is really well dialed in, and the steering is definitely a willing partner out in your favorite winding mountain road. And if I wanted to take it to the next level, I could put it in the full-on N mode and really firm up the suspension, but I find the comfortable suspension setting to be just fine, actually. It definitely is less bouncy out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here. This is still a paved road, obviously, but it's not the best paved road in the world, and the stiffest suspension mode is just a little bit too firm for my tastes. But again, custom mode really solves that problem. If you're looking for an absolute blast under $35,000, you should definitely put the Veloster on your list. It's important to remember that the Veloster is a relatively inexpensive vehicle. It's also a subcompact vehicle, not a compact car. It starts at $18,900 for the base model, and remember, a lot of the interior and exterior of the Veloster N is shared with that base model. If you want the regular turbo, that's $25,750 starting. If you want the Veloster N, that's $32,250, and the 8-speed dual-clutch transmission is an extra $1,500 option. Instead of our detailed pricing and comparison section, let's just talk about what the Veloster is and what it is not. Again, it is important to remember it's a subcompact vehicle, it's not compact, so it's going to be a lot smaller on the inside than something like a GTI or especially the Civic Type R, which is considerably bigger. You should also know that for 2021 and 2022, competition is a little bit tricky because the Volkswagen GTI has been completely redesigned. It's now going to be out there for 2022, and the Honda Civic has been completely redesigned in sedan and hatchback form, and we don't know exactly which version is going to get which performance engine under the hood. Expect the Civic Si and the Civic Type R to resurrect at some point. We just don't know exactly when that will be. So at this point in time, if you want a Honda Civic Type R, they're all sold. So you should definitely try and find one on the used market, or you might be able to find a dealer that has been clinging on to one of the very last models built. But either way, it's really not the most direct competition because it's an awful lot larger. It is also more expensive. Keep in mind, people are paying well above MSRP still for the Type R, and it is taking at least a year off. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. We might see one for 2023, but we don't have any details yet. But keep in mind that that Honda Civic Type R is $37,895 if you can somehow get one for MSRP, and used ones are going even above MSRP right now. There's no dual clutch option. It's a 4-door hatchback and it's considerably larger. It also is more grown up than the Veloster N. We then have the Civic Si at $25,200 starting. The next generation Civic Si is likely going to be following a very similar formula. Expect Volkswagen GTI or GLI levels of performance for a price tag that is less than the Type R, but more available. Likely sedan only, but details are still a little bit sketchy. We also have the Volkswagen GTI starting at $30,540. That is the new one, and going on up to about $39,000, depending on the options that you get. Those options are important because other than the DCT and some paint colors, we don't really have options on the Veloster N. It just comes the way that you've been seeing it in this video. With that out of the way, let's just talk about specifically the pros and cons for the Veloster N itself. It's going to be a lot easier to buy than the Honda Civic Type R. The Civic Type R has been very limited in availability, likely because it was built in England. It is now going to be built in the United States, however. The next generation model will be built here. It is heaps of fun, but a different kind of fun than we find in some of the competition, and the DCT is absolutely excellent. It also means that very much like the Volkswagen GTI and GLI, it's going to be more accessible to people that don't want to buy a manual or just aren't interested in it. I know that may sound crazy for an enthusiast-oriented vehicle. I love manual transmissions, but would I buy one right now at this point in my life? Probably not. I think that the DCT is just a little bit easier to deal with. If I were looking for simply a weekend car rather than a daily commuter, then I would certainly get the manual transmission. But if I were going to be driving it every day in stop and go or slow and go traffic, I would probably just be lazy and get the DCT. You're also going to go faster, more reliably, 0 to 60 in the DCT every time than the manual transmission because the computer can shift faster than you can. On the downside, the Hyundai Veloster N is certainly more cramped on the inside than any of these other options. Remember, it's a smaller vehicle. It has a tighter back seat. It has 3 doors, not 4 doors. And on the inside, it feels less premium, especially than the Volkswagen GTI. Remember, the base model starts well under $20,000, actually under $19,000. So a lot of the interior components were designed for that $18,900 starting price. The 3-door setup is a little bit funky, not just in terms of practicality, but also in terms of aesthetics. One side of the car is going to look different than the other. And the Veloster N is certainly tuned towards the firmer side of things. If you're looking for something that's a bit more grown-up, a bit more comfortable, a bit more daily driver livable, you might want to look somewhere else. But as a result, the Veloster N ends up in, honestly, a very unique niche here. If you're looking for the ultimate hot hatch in America, I would argue that the Veloster N is that ultimate hot hatch because it is definitely affordable. $32,250 puts it within the price range of a wide variety of mainstream vehicles, whether we're talking about a mid-size sedan or a mid-size crossover or compact crossovers, compact SUVs, etc. This is right in that same price range. So if you're shopping for a Toyota Camry or a Honda Accord and you decide I'd rather have a hot hatch, this is going to be in that same affordability window. It's also going to be relatively fuel efficient, pretty reliable according to what we've seen from the Veloster so far, and definitely inexpensive to keep around. Now, the question that so many of you have been asking me over on our social media channels is, yeah, but is it better than a Honda Civic Type R or a Volkswagen GTI? I would say no, it is not better than those. I like the grown-up feel that we find in the Civic Type R especially, even though it does feel pretty old at this point with the interior design, etc. The way that it drives and the way that it feels out on the road is very much my flavor. It has a very livable suspension tune, even though it does get pretty firm with the adaptive dampers. It's pretty easy to live with in the comfort mode, and I love the amount of power and the way that power is delivered. It also has a really elegantly designed front suspension. And the Volkswagen GTI is honestly the benchmark for hot hatches worldwide. It's definitely a bit more practical, again, a bit more grown-up, etc. But the grown-up nature of the Honda and the Volkswagen mean that they're less raw, less direct, less engaging to drive than the Veloster N, and I think ultimately less fun. And that is the big thing about the Veloster N. It is heaps and heaps of fun. So if you're simply looking for the most fun that you can have in an affordable hot hatch in the United States, the Veloster N is quite simply the hatch to buy. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and what would you get if you were shopping right around $30,000 to $34,000? Remember, the Veloster N comes in right around $32,250 plus, of course, the pesky destination charge, and that is going to be less than a top trim GTI, and certainly less than most people will be paying for the Civic Type R. Let me know what you think about that down there. Find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you later.